in the audience live here in Austin, and you were a contributor, we wish we had a big enough long table here, because that would be the ideal setup, of course, for a group conversation. But if you stay towards the first couple of rows, we only have 8 microphones, but we want to definitely make sure everyone who's sitting with something has a chance to lift it up and put it out into the world. So once more, I'm Sarah Wilbur, one of the co-conveners here, and members of the Equitable Arts Infrastructure Research Group: Derek Miller, Colleen Hooper, Jasmine Mahmood, Michael C. Uy, Charlotte Canning, and Paul Bonin-Rodriguez. Now I'm at the podium. This wasn't really the plan, but whenever our group gets together, usually on an annual basis, face-to-face, in our respective communities, we were most recently in Seattle with Jasmine, we have events that are about, putting our heads together as a group, but then also expanding our research group through invitation to community artists and policymakers, and we get to meet and work with people on the ground and people in different posts. This event was structured in the same spirit, right? So this is our enlarged learning community, and we're so grateful for everyone's presence. What we thought we'd say out loud is that the structure of this conversation hopefully is a continuation of what we've done. We're not being product-oriented about this. This isn't, let's list our policy recommendations. But if you're sitting with one, and that's what you need to lift up, we're not going to say no to anything. And what else did we say? And we'll take the time that it takes. If you happen to be on the live stream with us and you didn't log on and contribute a question, we have someone monitoring that live stream. If you weren't on a panel with someone else who is a contributor, but you have something to ask them about, or, hey, I wasn't in the labor panel, but I have a program I want to lift up. I think continuing to inventory practices, models, anti-models, all these different kinds of ways of embodying this, I think, is basically the goal. So did I misspeak, or did I sort of get that in the space? Fantastic. And we have folks with microphones that will hop, skip, and jump around to do that. So other than that, just gratitude and thanks for me. We've heard it from me a lot. So do I want to have any of my colleagues want to share out something they're sitting with to start, or in the community of our extended research group, the non-product oriented at the moment research group? You're all promoted.
I'll do it. The penultimate session, I want to highlight the real agreement that there was. And I think there's agreement in this room. There's not agreement in this country. And the agreement is that if people feel like their health and housing and food and education, their basic needs are being met, that the possibilities for human flourishing grow immensely. This is a very controversial view right now politically, and that is to say, it's under direct attack. We've moved to that direction as a country. We're not moving in that direction. We're going backwards right now. Everything else we're doing, so much else in the American theater are forms of bandages to try to cover that fact. So much of my frustration with my university is also because the university is bearing the burden of having to do these things for its staff, faculty, and students because the government's not doing it. So health, housing, education, basic needs, we can probably add a few in there. If we can do those, provide those collectively as a society, the largest possible group, then all of this changes radically. And I think that's fundamentally the vision that most of us want. We want the ability to sit around and worry about how to produce seasons of art that are more interesting, more exciting, more radical, more inventive, more creative, involve more people, bring in more communities. And we're trying to do all that while also making sure we have health care for our employees. And those challenges have nothing to do with each other in some way, but they're embedded together in the American system. So I wanted to acknowledge that. The other thing I wanted to say, I had two more things and they'll be briefer. The first is Nataki Garrett's great comment about theater being pass-fail. During the sort of flourishing of theater as the key social and entertainment activity in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries in places like the United States and England and throughout Europe, theaters offered different shows every single evening, and every evening had multiple different shows. This is not a model of production that we've gone into. Everything about our artistic training, everything that actors train to do, everything that designers train to do is about building up a unique experience that then runs as long as we can make it run. And that's it. And those constraints have to do with either financial success or the calendar of the theater or what have you. And something new every night model or or 6 things new every night model sounds impossible, but it's only impossible because we are used to making theater in this way where everything has 4 weeks of rehearsal, if you're lucky, and there's an expensive set and expensive lighting and all that. So I think there's a version of theater, there's an opportunity to try theater in an urban market probably that has a theater-going habit, but to try to build different kinds of audiences for a theater that's messier, that's looser, that's more cliched, that's more repetitive, that's less inventive, but that can do some of the things that we value in theater. And the last thing is a half joke, half serious, which is that if society collapses and all the technology falls apart, no one's going to be able to watch TV or film anymore, and theater will come roaring back. And so we should all go reread Anne Washburn's Mr. Burns or enjoy Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, great artistic expressions of the value of theater in the post-apocalyptic hellscape towards which we are rapidly heading. There we go.
With joy and dancing.
With joy and dancing, yes.
Thanks so much. Caretha Mitchell, she, her pronouns. I'm going to admit first, well, okay, so I'm sure of the person who said the first thing I'm gonna, as you say, lift up. Sarah Z, wait, no, Laura Z, am I right? Okay, yes. Laura Z. And I don't know, like, I hope this is useful, maybe just to talk about the importance of having your story heard and held. And if I understood Laura correctly, the suggestion was part of what we're dealing with right now are people who don't feel like their stories have been heard and held. And if I understood that correctly, I took that to mean I don't know, for abbreviation's sake, people who stormed the Capitol. And if I'm wrong about that, I'd like to know. But I think that that's who we're talking about. Like, what makes it so easily exploitable? And I understood Laura to say, because their stories don't seem to be heard and held. So I want to lift that up, admitting that maybe I got it wrong. And I wanted to put that in conversation with, oh, this was Laura Z too. It would be a shame if we waste a crisis to build the world we want. And immediately I thought to myself, but that's exactly what we did with COVID. The moment that we saw that Black and brown people were the main people dying. So I think that when you ask about like what's sitting with me throughout this time, I think what's sitting with me throughout this time has something to do with the fact that we make the meaning of our lives with the stories we tell, and we just don't have practice telling stories that really are about being what you called accountability practitioners.
Caretha, I really appreciate you bringing all of that up. And I think the reason I brought up about violence against Black women, it's just something that I've been thinking about a lot, again, with LA Times, Washington Post, and not allowing those editorials. And my colleague at UW, Odai Johnson, has this phrase, deep cultural memory. So I find it as to be a deep cultural memory in the United States that's like never said, but always enacted. And I think about the history of theater. The most popular form of theater in the 19th century was blackface minstrelsy. The discourses those told that still exist, And so there's like, from your statement, I feel like there's like an undercurrent in like the work, the aesthetic, the homo narrans, the storytelling work that many of our fields do. And how are we thinking about that? It gets tricky, right, with like propaganda, but how are we thinking about that in dialogue with policy? I guess, well, it gets tricky with propaganda at the same time as this anti-DEI moment. How do we think about that in dialogue with policy and infrastructure? Like, what might it mean to think about policy and infrastructure that acknowledges the deep cultural memory of violence against Black women, violence against Indigenous people, and violence against other people? What might it mean to think about infrastructure that's about storytelling that is holding and hearing people, and I love that phrase, in dialogue with accountability. So that's just, I'm just like riffing on what you said, is like, I think, how might we think about, especially because policy and infrastructure was one of the main tools that violence against many people has long been perpetuated in our culture.
And I just want to be absolutely clear that I'm not saying that Laura Z is not an accountability practitioner. I don't know. I just want to make sure I make that clear. That's not what I'm saying. I'm like lifting up a couple things that in conversation for me had some tension. So that's all.
Since I'm Laura Z, can I say something? I think when I think about like people's story, all of us have a need for our story to be heard and held. And I think, to your point, part of why I think that is important to think about now is because we don't start there when we talk about policy. We try to start with a top-down way that's like, well, we'll make a new policy and then people will get over whatever thing has harmed them deeply for generations. And so whether that is, you know, if that's in a community that has had a big economic shift and we're telling them like, oh, well, the new, you know, these are the new jobs you'll have. There's a human element that has to be acknowledged of like what it means to move on from any historical trauma. And I think that is like it is really individual work that is absolutely connected to policy and system change. And I think like we have a cultural inclination in this country to not want to do that hard individual work, and we want to just say, this top-down policy, this political party will be the thing that fixes this. And it just leaves a lot of people, it doesn't actually change people's hearts and minds or their cultural patterns or their historic traumas. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. That was an unpleasant metaphor. I wasn't thinking about that specifically related to people who stormed the Capitol. But I suppose if I'm being my most like graceful self, then it also, yes, them. But no, I meant more people who have been structurally harmed by the systems we're living in.
Hello, Esther Kim Lee. I want to first of all congratulate you on this really successful symposium, and it was such an inspiring and very provoking event. So I really appreciate being here. I've been thinking about during the 2 days. I kept thinking about Kendrick Lamar. Because he's embodied this kind of protest and brilliance at the right time, right form, and he's so popular, right? So I wanted to ask, is there a place for popular culture, embracing popular culture? This goes back to what you're saying. I mean, like the type of theater you're talking about, that's popular culture, right? If you want to make theater popular again, like, how much of a popular culture do you bring in? I think if we lose federal funding for the arts, that allows experimentation, innovation that might not be popular, but that may push the arts into something, a new form, which we all want to see. But if that is not there, like, what is the plan B, right, in order for the arts to survive? So how much of kind of popular culture plays in or may play a role in the survival of the arts? I guess that's a question to the panel.
I guess I'm the music historian on the panel, and someone who teaches Kendrick Lamar in his class. I obviously think a lot about his role in society. It's so multi-layered because of how rap and hip hop are consumed on such a wide basis, including by consumers who continue to hold very hateful and despicable ideas about the culture that it emerges from. And his performance at the Super Bowl, the misunderstandings of his performance while it was still so powerful, the reactions against it, the bigotry that continues to exist. Yet I still love the spirit of your question about popular culture's role, hip-hop's role within social change. That's just riffing. I don't think that's a good response or an adequate response, but I think it helps us continue to think about, we've talked a lot about nonprofit arts here. We've started to delve a little bit into commercially successful art, commercially successful music, but it has to have a role. Culture has that powerful movement has to have a role in societal change. And so I just really appreciate you bringing that up. Jasmine wants to say something.
Two things. I love that question, Esther. Two things. One is this idea of an entertainment tax, which I just want to put out there. I just think it could. What might it mean to always have a 1% tax on, like, let's say the entertainment has to be profitable, like the artist has to make a minimum of like $500,000, but what might it mean to have that tax fund arts funding and like that be literally the source of the endowment? And the second thing, I'm luckily off, but in 2024 I became a TikTok addict, and I literally was on TikTok upwards of like 10 hours a day. It was not good. I wasn't sleeping. I was obsessed. The algorithm got me. But one thing that was really interesting about TikTok is that once you get 10 million followers, that's when you can start monetizing your videos. And what was interesting about that is the extent to which artists, like there was this one like ballet dancer that was like dancing to like hip hop. It had like millions of there was these dancers that were dancing this Cirque du Soleil dancers, and they were doing like all like the meme, and they had millions of followers. And I was thinking about and I will say I still have it, but I'd made an arts TikTok where I was reviewing arts in Seattle. But I was thinking about the extent to which artists were getting monetary profit off of this popular app. And so in thinking about Popular, one, how might we resource popularity to support all arts genres, and two, that like I get why kids were going on TikTok, because some kids were making like, I mean, more than I make a month, you know? Like there's people that were like buying, there's this woman, this influencer that like bought a house in the Hamptons and bought a Range Rover, and everyone's like, she's 25. And so what does it mean that a lot of young folks, the Zoomers, were turning to TikTok as a way to share their love, like dance, all the dance mom kids, to share their love for the arts and to monetize it. And for them, that made sense. They were like, I'm gonna of course film my entire life, because this is a way I can live as an artist.
I have an interesting point here, thinking about the last panel and this idea of abundance. So we're thinking through this concept of abundance, and so that's something that I'm stimulated by with your question, Esther, because what is there an abundance of? And then what if we could intersect abundance with Caritha's call for accountability practitioners? Like, we have an abundance of X, and then we have people who are stepping into these roles of, you know, being accountability practitioners to have these conversations about what is being produced, what is being monetized, how it's impacting people, and bringing these conversations forward and really working in dialogue with each other, which I think this weekend was a great example of. And when I talk to my students about social media, we do discuss it, and they say, you always have to be careful to diversify, because we did have that 24 hours that TikTok went black, and we didn't know what was going to be happening with these things. So it's interesting how the younger generation is very cognizant of the fact that you need to have something in real time, because what if technology does, evaporate in some way? And they're very cognizant of the dimensionality of wanting to be in contact with one another, but then also venturing into these other realms, but having this sense of different personas and different ways of moving in and out of spaces, and knowing that a lot of these spaces are not going to be permanent within their artistic careers. So those are some of the things I was thinking about.
Could I jump in if that's, but tying together Colleen and Jasmine and this idea of abundance and a possible entertainment tax, we have an abundance of hoarders. We have an abundance of wealth and power hoarders. I love the idea of generating other sources of revenue for artists, possibly through an entertainment tax, but I could also see the ways an entertainment tax might be regressive, like an ad valorem tax, where the people who are going to concerts, they come from all sorts of demographics, but to tax their purchase of entertainment tickets, commercially successful, might just reinforce taxation systems that don't target the right people, in my opinion, the people who are hoarding wealth and power. And maybe that just needs to get emphasized more and more again. For me, I brought this up yesterday informally at a table conversation, but I'm just so personally distraught by attacks on DEI, on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Words and ideas that would make this world more equal, that would make this world fairer, that would make this world richer, when we should be attacking not just hoarding, but nepotism and bigotry. So instead of attacking DEI, we should be attacking nepotism, hoarding, bigotry, all those things that actually tear us apart rather than enriching our lives. So that's what I've been thinking about.
I just wanted to say this very briefly, and there are people who know about this, and I'm not one of them. We've talked a little bit about social media in various contexts. Some percentage of social media posts that's much larger than zero are probably worth thinking about more as just part of the arts ecology in the United States and around the world right now. Not every TikTok video or YouTube video that my children seem to watch on an endless loop is artistic or should be put into the category of art. But I think a lot of them are. They're just so unrelated to the aesthetic categories and aesthetic framings and technical training and all the kinds of things that we usually think are associated with artistic expression. But it's really easy to make an artistic expression and share it with a community of like-minded friends through these apps. A lot of them are ephemeral, a lot of them aren't public, et cetera, et cetera. People are writing about this, people don't know about this. I don't think it's in my I'll say this about myself. It's not in my thinking about the cultural ecology of the United States right now.
Okay, so I'm really tired. So I don't know if any of this is going to make sense, but you all seem to be very kind people, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. I just want to share a couple things that in my mind are somehow related to what we've been saying, and also in that same mind are really smart, thoughtful remarks. But if they're not, I don't really need you to tell me, okay? You could just privately be depressed about the state of the mind at the University of Texas. So like I said, they're sort of unrelated, but they're really pressing on me. So when we came in on yesterday, one of the things I was sort of steeling myself was for this event to be more or less like my life at UT as a teacher, as a scholar. I do, as many of you know, a lot of administrative work. I'm the secretary of the general faculty, so I spend a lot of time with the executive administration of this university. And, You don't need me to tell you how depressing that is. But what's also been pressing on me is how frustrating it is, because how uninventive folks seem to be about how to respond to all these different things going on. And I don't say that in a judgmental way. I don't think any university administrator at any level, at Christmas break in 2024 thought, oh, what if they take hundreds of millions of dollars away from the universities? What will we do? I mean, was literally unimaginable. I collaborate with a lot of folks in the College of Natural Sciences and the College of Engineering, and they're staggered right now. Like they are us in the 80s and 90s. So I thought that would be what this would be. And instead, what has been so amazing to me is how each person who's come up here has provided so many interesting ideas, but also examples of things that have worked. The multiplicity of stories. I mean, we use stories sometimes in lazy ways, like tell our stories. But each specific story we have heard yesterday and today about looking at local specifics, looking at systemic things that that you both cannot solve but have to solve, right? I take your comment, because also universities, it used to, like, when my mom was a college student, it was all about in loco parentis. Like, they had to know where those students were at every time, especially if you were a woman student, right? You had to be in the dorm at such and such a clock, no boys, etc. 60s and 70s, woo, we hate you. We're going to do whatever the fuck we want. But suddenly, that pendulum is swinging, and they're like, universities, you should take care of us. You should have this service and that service and this service. I'm neutral on that, but what I'm saying is it takes a lot of resources to do those services, and those services are often because systemically they're not being provided in other ways. Okay, that does sound like I'm going off topic a little bit, and yet we keep having to solve them because we don't get any choice. So one of the things that so heartened me, sitting back there in my little coughing bubble, has been how many different things people are doing and how they're doing them really well. Like, I've been at UT for over 30 years, so I've seen every in and out of Texas performing arts. And what Bob Bercy described to us yesterday is nothing short of a miracle. That in this, place, in this time, he has more than doubled that budget. And he gets very little from the university, very little from the state. They're virtually freestanding. So even just that story, but it's not like that was a unique moment in these 2 days. So that's really exciting to me, and I have to sit with my notes. I need to rewatch the recordings to really think about that and think what I can pull out and what I can then take back to my students to say, no. There's all this amazing stuff out there, and you need to know about this person or this organization and this thing. The other thing I want to say is just a little bit of urging us not to think singularly. Like, maybe someday we'll have single-payer health care in this country. It's maybe not in my lifetime. So maybe think about different ways of going about solving problems or addressing problems, whether or not they're solved, that are very multiple, and like, we'll do it for this over here and that over there. And as we heard on the panel today, that doesn't always work, right? The union thing, et cetera. But I think that focusing on how many different ways we can address things is also very energizing, because one of the things I thought about a lot as we were hearing about how to use a crisis or I thought back to 2008, when the scourge to our backs during that huge recession was, do less with more. Don't waste a crisis. I think that's capitalism talk. I think that's really capitalism trying to make us think about crisis as something that's maybe welcome. a lot of people suffered in 2008. A lot of us people in this room, even if it was just exhaustion and burnout and being overwhelmed, like during the pandemic. I was joking with someone last night that I got really jealous of all those people in the pandemic who were like, I'm baking bread, I'm doing extra yoga. I was like, I'm on 47 more committees as we figure out how to move 50,000 undergraduates and 10,000 graduate students onto Zoom in 2 weeks. So, okay, that's a little ranty, and I don't mean to be too ranty, but what I guess I want to wrap it up with, and then I'll just stop talking altogether, is because our music historian, not theater, music historian, put me on vocal rest yesterday, and you see how well that went. But a couple of weeks ago, the representative, U.S. representative who represents where I live in Austin. Austin is one of the most gerrymandered cities in the United States. And every census, they try to get rid of the Democrats. Lloyd Doggett has been one of them who's hung on, and he's represented some part of Austin pretty consistently for about 30 years. And he held a town hall on the 15th of February. And I went, and it was about 3 hours on a Saturday morning. It was very interesting, both like seeing, part of it made me feel empowered and strengthened, and part of it made me want to weep. But one of the things he did articulate a strategy. And it's not, it's specific to being, in his role, but I wonder what parts of this we might think about. And so the thing he said to us that day was, litigate, legislate, motivate. And it really made me think about my classroom, about the tools that I have to bear, and like, what is it I could do in each of those categories? Or maybe I want to bring up new categories. But for example, I've signed on to a lawsuit 2 years ago, about the Texas drag bill ban. Some of you who are at ASTR heard me speak about that as an expert witness about why drag is, okay, it's fine, don't worry. Under the auspices of the ACLU and the Texas Civil Rights Project. Motivate, I think, is a lot of what we have. So, not sure how all that adds up, but those are my early thoughts. And those are sort of, if nothing else, the categories of inquiry I'm going to be bringing as I try to look at what we've done over these 2 days and think about what are the next set of possibilities.
Looks like Angie's got one in the corner.
So I have a question, and it's riffing a little bit on the whole notion of community, going back to community, listening to stories, etc. I will clarify, there's extensive research, one more recently by Roosevelt Institute, about the role of Black women, and when you take care of Black women, how important it is for social cohesion in a community level, but also their economy. And because of that kind of research, at our organization, we prioritize Black women. Anyone can apply, but we do prioritize, how are they faring, because they really, there are just so many examples right now across the country where they are holding a movement for community ownership of their economic assets. And that's important, because when we talk about who doesn't want folks to win on the progressive, it's not just current day people who we saw on January 6th. It's decades long, deliberate dispossession and disinvestment that hollowed out cultural communities that should be reflecting our society at artistic expression levels, but really don't have the capacity to be fans, whether it's on social media, followers, consumers. It's a whole market class, and in that sense, there's a hip hop element, which is, I would argue that when you have people at community levels in diverse societies with disposable income, that you get the jazz age, you get hip hop, you get all sorts of different things, and that absolutely needs to be part of the equation. So my question to whomever, if you feel so inclined, is there a population in America, and it's an identity-based population, that you feel like our progressive pendulum swing will go through? So when we come out of, McCarthyism, when we come out, I mean, there are just certain populations that helped, be at the right place in the right moment, and people went and took their cars to Selma. They created momentum for certain action to take place at policy levels. We're trying to think about that. Is it certain immigrant populations? Is it the wider LGBTQ, although right now they're being divided? Is it once again American Black Southerners over and over again? So knowing that, to me, becomes then very important about what's the equitable arts infrastructure that we need to be building for, so that we don't keep doing what we do politically, which is rely on Black voters in the South to save all of us, and then don't actually build infrastructure that actually works for them.
This might be a zigzag, because I have written down about 5 times to return to Adam Fong's projects that are really comprehensive in their thinking about leveraging multiple types of economic investment and in a way that maybe doesn't even stop. See, here's a real risk of privatization, doesn't stop holding our federal government accountable for basic human entitlements. But I guess I want to say out loud, like, when we all heard from Dr. Jackson last night, this idea of comprehensive approaches to community cultural development, it's it sounds very vague, but I think the thing that I'm attracted to about this are the economic models that are emerging when wealth holding decision makers at the level of private philanthropy, at the level of the federal government, are actively partnering with public health and actual health foundations, health investors, and we're talking about a $4.7 trillion industry all of a sudden. The stakeholders change radically, and everyone's expectations and the value propositions change radically. But underneath all of that, I see a lot of equity work going on, because when we start talking about structural, determinants of health and social drivers of health, this idea of populations who haven't had their stories heard and held, all of that is wound up together. And again, my fangirl Maria Jackson moment, every time I see her confront that question of why knit cultural resourcing into economic development, transportation, housing, all the things, she says her answer is historical. If across ages and cultures, strategies to oppress have involved stripping people of their worldviews, then every policy should have economic drivers toward cultural development at the core, right? So if I am fighting for anything, it's really to say, can we figure out not only, we know who won't fall out of the net. If we don't tax the wealthy in this country, we don't actually, there's not a exclusion that's going to happen. It's not in statute. But I think noticing, and maybe Adam can speak to these programs again, federally qualified health centers, there's just been a lot of really interesting work being done on Medicaid, people writing, since ARPA and since COVID, like rewriting and trying to get exemptions for Medicaid to reroute money toward adding arts-based participation to community health referrals for low-income populations. It's called Arts on Prescription. There's a whole movement, but it's really trying at the wealth holding level, at the level of decision-making, institutional decision makers, do economic redistribution in such a way that makes immediately evident the intersectional racial class politics of the US arts infrastructure. So, why does guaranteed basic income get exciting? Because it immediately makes clear who's not eligible for that in the arts world. So because it starts with economic determinants, which are linked, of course, to social drivers, right? So I just keep saying, like, are there investments at the top level? I don't know, I keep thinking, I want to hear Adam talk about this. This is why I mentioned you 3 times. At the level of a funder, thinking really inventively about, like, how to leverage not only institutional capital, but connections to resource. I won't even keep saying money, but resource to redistribute wealth and decision-making power in the way that allows cultural kitchens to actually be resourced, because they're all everywhere with no access to capital, right? So I just keep thinking, like, money it is medicine. I buy the decolonizing wealth mantra. I mean, I think you have to think about trauma as linked to economic disinvestment, of course, in this country. So are there programs out there? I think they're hard to understand if you don't understand housing policy, and if you don't understand what a federally qualified health system is. Like, we've already lost half the audience in the arts, right? But I think taking time like we're doing here to translate how the machinations of those things work is a step toward helping anyone who wants to express themselves know some routes to some capacities to do that. Do you have anything to say about that, Adam? I mean, you've been sitting here now for like a lot of days since we gave you a microphone, but this was our very first panel and you missed it. And I might have been just like, I might have destroyed like everything you shared because it was a while ago, but it really was inspiring to me.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try to respond and then also quickly turn it back with a question. But I think the short answer is yes, there are a lot of really interesting things happening with private resources as the sort of enabling force for innovation, I guess I'll call it. And I'll just drop one other recommendation to your point about the arts and health intersection. Sierra Health Foundation in the Bay Area is doing a really interesting body of work. They're the foundation arm that's connected to the Sierra Health Centers, which are the healthcare providers, in which they are trying to fund those community arts practitioners in a way that will enable them to become Medicaid-eligible health providers. So it really focuses on, which populations are they uniquely able to reach with their programs. And we see in that same work a lot of other intersections, like, for example, an arts and environmental education initiative that is proving to be one of the most effective health interventions, especially for transition age youth of certain demographics. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I mean, I think to your point about like not wanting to be a replacement government, that's always a danger, especially with the level of wealth that we're talking about, especially in a place like California. And that puts me in mind of really the question that I wanted to ask. I know a lot of our conversation has been circumscribed by the U.S. and its territories, but some of the news of the last few days have been about the position of the United States in the sort of global sphere. And I think we all know that culture is one of the main things that the U.S. exports. The culture of its economies, its cultural expressions, the ways that our institutions are built are often models for developing countries, right? And so I wonder, when we ask this question about equitable arts infrastructure, to what degree we want to reflect on our country's position as a superpower, its position as an empire, knowing full well that that may or may not reflect the experiences of the people that we care about or the artists that we seek to support. So, it's something that I'm just turning over in my mind because, especially in the Bay Area, a lot of the people we support feel closer to their family members in North Africa or in Latin America than they do to their neighbors who live an hour away. So it's a reality that I think in a particularly diverse place we have to face up to in our work. But I wonder how it sort of shows up in your thinking and in your research agendas.
Okay. Thank God Derek's read my work. Well, I mean, I think that that's the other thing, too, that maybe we didn't do as much, or we haven't yet done as much thinking about as we could or should, is a lot of the ways that we got the NEA, that we were able to institutionalize the arts, was because during the Cold War, and that again, back to that quotation I read, the state will support cultural work when it's in the best interests of the state, was during the Cold War, the state needed stuff to export. It needed to promote jazz. It needed to promote, it often was modern dance. Dance and music were the two most popular categories because, of course, you didn't have to translate language. So what's interesting was part of the argument to institutionalize, especially in theater, but it was also all the performing arts, was that they served the national interest. And, there were a lot of missteps with that exporting stuff. But what I find interesting and what I think about a lot now is, what is that side of the partnership? Like, there was also a keen interest in seeing arts from the U.S. And that gave credibility back at home. And I think someone mentioned yesterday about the grant environment where it's easier to get grants at home if you toured someone else or somewhere else, or you've been, especially outside the U.S. I think that that's very much part of it, is if you think about this in isolation or as purely a domestic issue, you miss the ways it's always operated historically. And it's historically always operated as some kind of either international or transnational or global partnership and movement.
Can I jump back briefly? Oh, I don't know if Dr. Kim left, but to kind of address that question of, are there specific populations or groups that have been more historically underrepresented or underserved? And I completely agree that there absolutely have been groups that have been excluded to a much greater extent than others, while at the same time, the program that I research, this expansion arts program of the National Endowment for the Arts, so much of its power and compelling that it convinced Republicans that it was best part of the NEA was through coalition building across different demographics, that it represented America at its best because it was so diverse. So now I see Dr. Kim back. Just addressing your question again about are there certain groups that we could help more, while at the same time having a very holistic and comprehensive approach that that coalitions are needed to instill greater social change is the historical lesson that I've taken away from my area of study.
I will just say a few things briefly about the international thing. The first is that the international traffic in the arts is subject to the same questions about protectionism versus internationalism and trade that any other industry is. It's not often that we see it very baldly, but there are debates in the late 19th century about tariffs on theatrical scenery and costumes. I've written an extremely dull academic article on the subject. No, it's actually, no, it's dull. There were intermittent battles about immigration for performing artists and visas. I think we could probably anticipate to see more of these issues coming up in the coming years. There's things like the O visas and the way they apply. These are also negotiated at the level of the unions. And so there are stories about that. So tariffs and protectionism have both had their places in the history of the American theater. I haven't done studies about how other countries treat these things. The other is that you mentioned, thinking about the way we're a model around the world for much of the 20th century for certain kinds of democratic government. A lot of countries took up our model for better or worse. I don't know that people have modeled our arts infrastructure, and I don't think Brian knows. Brian will answer about this. But there are rather, I'm remembering the moment in the late 19th century again when the independent theater movement is coming into fruition in Europe to stage the modern drama, the non-commercial drama. And when that comes around, what you see is every single country that takes this up has the same moment where some founders are like, we must have a national theater. It must express the true reality of our country, just like the national theaters of these other 9 countries. And so there's this sort of like, we're totally different from anyone else, and we are going to copy exactly what they have done to prove it to you. So it's a funky dynamic that comes out in the 19th century when that happens. Brian's going to say.
Does someone have a microphone to? Oh, yes.
Oh my God, he had
I had one in my pocket, yeah.
Brian had a microphone in his pocket.
So I think the only thing I want to really speak to that is I think the one aspect that I can point to with authority is the one aspect of American art making that has been exported and has transformed local art making economies is the model of extractive or commodity-based casting. Which is the models of casting of, instead of it being relationship-based or company-based or training-based, over the last 40 years in particular, most, it's totally transformed Bollywood, it's totally transformed Nollywood. The adaptation of a producer-friendly model of commodity-based casting has spread like capitalist wildfire because it is fundamentally capitalist wildfire. It suits the needs of the producers. And so I do think when we look at the corporate, of the models of, and this goes back to popular culture and commercial culture generally, what does continues as models are capitalist models of production. Those are circulated, which is, again, we haven't talked a whole lot about that this time. But I do think that, and that has been in addition to the current changes in the governance structure of our country, of the U.S. right now, I think capitalism has been the other recurring electric wire that has guided every conversation we've had. Is how does the charge or shock, or how to dodge the harm or capture the fire of capitalism seems to be one of the threads that is as present as what the heck is going on with the current administration that has haunted every conversation we've had. Because I have the mic, and I was in my pocket the whole time, but I'm gonna use it now. I do want to, not to derail, but to name. The one reflection I have is a reflection I've been sitting with very awkwardly over the last 15 or 20 minutes, because the thing and I've shared this with my little group as well as a couple other friends in the room, is I came out of the last panel sort of personally very unsettled, because I witnessed in that extraordinary constellation of voices, especially at the end with the moment of the manifest, 4 folks with very different experiences in the field, very different experiences in their life junctures at this moment, holding idealism in very distinct ways. And I realize, in a way that I find very unsettling and destabilizing, I don't know how I'm holding idealism right now. And I don't know how, and it makes me feel all kind of ways. And so I do think that that is something to name, because I do think that we did see, additionally, in a thread through almost every panel, glimpses of how to sustain idealism in the face of terror, brutality, and devastation. So I think that that is also something that the arts are a source for. And as a practitioner, as well as an advocate, as well as an educator, I find it very humbling that I am not sure where I'm holding idealism right now.
While you're getting the mic to Todd, if I could just tack on, because of course this is more interesting, but just want to add, the other thing that a lot of folks I've talked to in countries where they've moved away from robust government funding for the arts, the thing that a lot of arts practitioners in leadership roles have expressed to me is that they wish they had the tax system where charitable donations are deductible. I mean, that's one thing that I know there was a lot, especially in the early 2000s the 90s and early 2000s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and suddenly they're looking for how do we fund the arts. There was a lot of envy about the idea that one of the ways you could convince somebody who's wealthy to help fund your theater is that they would then get to claim that as a deduction on their income tax. So it's interesting to think about how tax law is often so integral to how theaters or the arts more generally can function. But we can go back to idealism now. That's more fun to talk about.
Well, yeah, I want to address that and also sort of something about the international and Charlotte's idea about motivating. But before I do, there are just 2 things I want to say. One is I'm really grateful to you all for creating a weekend that has this kind of thoughtful, intentional cohesion, as opposed to the other 40,000 conferences and symposia I've been to over the last 50 years, which are just sort of this and that and this and that. It feels like here we are and we're actually talking about something that, even though it's been very prismatic and very wide-ranging, we've been talking about the same thing all weekend, and I'm really grateful to you all. So thank you for all the work and thought and care you've put into this, and the warm welcome, what Donna, the hospitable house. And part of that is that I'm aware of even our own silos, that I've heard about so many studies and books and things over this weekend and work that relates to things that I have worked on for 30 or 40 years and I never knew about. So if there's some way, and part of that is the academic versus practitioner versus funder versus civic and social, that if there's some way for us to kind of, even it's like sustain the learning group or something, or the stories as we circulate them, I would welcome that. I do want to talk about something that hasn't come up in here, but it's deep. I'm deep in it, and it's related to much of what we're talking about, which is our government is modeling their response to the arts and education on Hungary, on Orban's Hungary. And about, 4 or 5 years ago, the Hungarian government under Orban made their first of what was a total takeover. And they started pretty much with the University of Film and Theater in Budapest. And the way that they took it over, which is really important, is they cast everything in terms of the culture wars and wokeness. And, you know, their version of DEI was under attack. The Orban government appointed, and forgive me if you know this, he appointed loyalists as the trustees of the universities, and starting with the theater and film. The trustees then they privatized the public assets, which included cinemas and places where the fields and the buildings and the resources of the universities. And the trustees who came in to run them, appointed by the government, had lifetime appointments and full say over hiring, admissions, and curriculum. So all autonomy, which university life is based on, was overthrown. The faculty, and I'm speaking of this because I'm in the process of working with my dear friend and colleague Laszlo Upor, who was the president of that university, or the rector at that time, and has written a book about the takeover in 2020. The faculty resigned over a period of time. They created a free university with 5 partner colleges in the Eastern and Central Europe to get the students through. The students blockaded the building and staged 71 days of public performances. These were theater kids and film kids, design kids. Public performances involving thousands of citizens. Extraordinary stuff. I wish I could go into detail. And they blockaded the building so that the Orban people could not come in. And then the second COVID lockdown happened. But they all went to this free university then and got through, but through schools in other parts of Europe. So all to say, this notion, there's something, and if you can even see some of the films of the student protests because they were performative as hell, and the faculty the students actually ran the whole resistance movement. You can see some of these online. It's so inspiring. It's right in the pocket of what we do. That is a lesson to us, I believe, even as the Orban takeovers are a lesson to the Trump administration. And it's a lesson to me in motivating, in using what we have to keep the fires lit. And it's not exactly idealism, and especially when you hear it from the point of view of the president of the university, who's been working now for 4 or 5 years for no money, teaching his students at age 67. It's not exactly idealism. It's a kind of wry Eastern European idealism, do you know? But it's incredibly moving, and it's the counterexample, Adam. It's what we can learn from other countries too, because everyone has gone through what we're going through now. We've felt so, it seems to me, so exceptional that American democracy will always win the day. So that's all I have to say. That's not really a question.
I'll say quickly, I share that with you about those resources. I've been, scribbling madly to make sure I find that study or read this or do that, right? And I want to say, having been in this kind of atmosphere in a lot of sort of initiative or program-based meetings over the years, I feel like this is the experience I've consistently had in terms of learning, and that really, when we started thinking about this, I realized this was such a great event for all of us to sort of give witness to the amazing amount of critical thinking, to the solution-oriented approach, to just the deep intellectual engagement of practitioners, cultural practitioners, who are constantly sort of, building up their knowledge and thinking through programs and offering solutions or insights or inspiration in some way. And I must say, I'm honestly overwhelmed at this point from that. It's every bit of social sustenance and intellectual sustenance I could have imagined, right? And so I have to say, we don't always agree. I see Don't Waste a Crisis. I think this group came together in a crisis, right? And it was a way to spend our screen time.
Which crisis? Oh, you mean the pandemic?
The pandemic crisis, that one.
Because we've been meeting for so long, there have been so many crises.
Well, yeah, we went through the recession together too. Yeah, and we had a whole thing. So anyway, these were moments, right? And then there's of course the long lag time to build enough momentum to do something like this, right? But we did sort of say going in, we're going to commit to some sort of transcript, some sort of, accretion of knowledge that we could share with people, this group first, right? Those that were there, just to say, this is what we heard, this was the experience, right? So that, and we could sort of put together some of those things, right? Because I feel like I'm always running behind the knowledge, or I have a FOMO because everyone's doing so many amazing things, right? And that narrative is in a direct counterpoint to the one of like, the sky's coming down and everything like that, right? Because what is happening in the sort of the big picture is being sort of constantly pecked at in the small, right? So that's something I'm just taking away.
There could be.
Which is, it was almost impossible for them to convince the other universities to act. So that the sense of people sleepwalking or rolling over through a crisis was so prevalent that I haven't even, in the translation process, I haven't even quite understood those passages. Because it's like, wait, but there's so much was going on, but in fact, everyone else was denying it. And so that sense of the frustration